In this video, I will give you a generic overview of how to write a results section. And in fact, I have two broad goals for this class. One, I would love for you to be able to generate something like this. And in fact, if you have a quantitative dissertation, you're going to have to generate something like this. In fact, it's going to be substantially longer than this. And two, so the first goal of this class in broad perspective is I would like you to be able to, one, generate a results section using SPSS and the knowledge that you gain in this course, and two, be able to interpret, understand, analyze a results section that you come across. So two broad goals: be able to create something like this and be able to understand something like this. It looks a little intimidating, but if you break it down by the pieces, it's not as bad as you imagine. And again, I will be here for the entire class and after the class to help you with your dissertation. So don't panic. I didn't master it the first time I took the class. In fact, I don't think I've mastered it yet. Right? So how would we go about writing this? Right? So the first thing, if you break it down piece by piece, and I will caution you, this is a generic format. It is just a little guide to help you write a results section. It does not have to look like this. You could read a dozen different results sections and find a dozen different formats. But I think this is a good generic format to help get you started and understand the process. So if you start your results section with briefly describe the data being analyzed, you will describe that in detail when you talk about your participants in the previous chapter of your dissertation. But in this case, you can just briefly mention who was being studied, how many of them, and so forth. And so in this case, I made up I made up some data comparing heights of men and women. I wanted to determine if they were statistically significant, if the differences were statistically significant. So I'm making this up completely, but let's imagine that I collected data from 20 college freshmen, and the package that we're using in this class is the statistical package for the social sciences. That's actually version 28.1. It's usually important to put the statistical package that you've used because they don't all work the same. They have different models. In some cases, if you're just computing a mean or a standard deviation, you're not going to see any significant differences. But if you're doing factor analysis, I know the SPSS has a default set for its rotation as something that I disagree with, and other packages may have a different default. So let the reader know what you used. For this class, it's going to be statistical package for the social sciences. Step two, state your hypothesis. And again, for your dissertation, you probably are going to have multiple hypotheses. But this is the simplest format I can come up with. It's an independent sample t-test. We have just one hypothesis. But again, if you take this format and you can just start recycling it for each hypothesis, before you know it, you've got a substantial results section. So state the hypothesis being tested and the statistical test or test used to test your hypothesis. So in this case, I'm letting the reader know an independent sample t-test was conducted, and I've made a directional hypothesis. And again, this will not be a mystery to you because you will have stated your hypotheses in chapter 1, that men are taller than women. Step 3, report relevant descriptive statistics. Typically, that's means and standard deviations, and I also included sample sizes. You'll notice I've got it in APA format, so it's capitalized, it's italicized, I've got spacing in between. Those are things that they will look for in your dissertation. Another paragraph, list the requirements and assumptions needed for the statistical test that you have chosen. So this is a big part, and it's a part a lot of students and researchers miss, is if I'm going to conduct an independent samples t-test, I can't just throw the data in SPSS and press go. Certain assumptions have to be met. So you would list what those assumptions are. And so I've listed the two generic assumptions. Your data should be normally distributed and there's homogeneity of variances. And then I say how they were tested. And so I tested normality looking at kurtosis and skewness, and you can actually use another test, the Shapiro-Wilks. And I tested normality, or the homogeneity of variances, with Levine's test. I reported those results. So you can't just you've selected a test and you can't just assume that, hey, I've got the data, I'm going to start analyzing the data. It just doesn't work that way. You shouldn't do it that way. And for your dissertation, if you've chosen a test, you should let the reader know, hey, I've chosen this test. These are the assumptions, requirements needed for this test, and I have tested for those. In many cases, all the assumptions, requirements are going to be met and you're good to go. Occasionally, I should say more than occasionally, you're going to run a test and you're going to say, hey, here's an assumption and it's been violated. What should I do? In many cases, a lot of these tests are what we call robust to certain violations if they're not too egregious. And so you could then say, well, this assumption was met, but the deviation from normality or so forth wasn't too profound. And based on the research of this person, they've demonstrated that it's okay to use it under these situations. Or you may say, hey, I've violated all of the assumptions, and there's no way I should use this test. And for this reason, I've chosen maybe a less powerful, less commonly known test. But here's why I had to go that route instead of using what maybe might be a more popular, commonly known test. Step 5, report the results from your statistical tests. So here, I've reported my effect size, and I'm a big advocate of effect sizes. To me, reporting whether your results are statistically significant or if they're statistically significant without some measure of effect size, to me, is just pointless. It just doesn't tell you much. Right? So I reported effect size, and I cited what Cohen considers a large effect size, and this is a large effect size. And in the section where it says print out in Canvas, I have a list of various effect sizes that are associated with various tests. Right? And I state that the results were statistically significant. We have a p-value less than 0.05, which is pretty much our standard. And then step 6, mention or discuss relevant tables as needed. Now, I've done 2 things here. I put this in italics and I put a little asterisk. And the reason I did that is because there's figures and tables can go throughout. They don't have to go here or here. I could have put table here after I mentioned my means and standard deviations, and it would have been perfectly appropriate for me to mention table 1. I mentioned it here after I reported skewness and kurtosis as well, but there's no reason I couldn't have put it here. And figure 1 doesn't have to be the last thing you see. I could have led off with a figure, letting the reader know what the data looks like with some standard error bars or confidence intervals, then reported the test and so forth. Right? And so that's it. At the end of the day, you would have something like this. A nice, succinct results section. Again, yours is going to be substantially larger, I would imagine, because you're going to have probably more than just one hypothesis, and I doubt you're going to have such a simple analysis. But the framework, the structure is the same. And so when you start adding multiple hypotheses and tests, it starts to look complicated. But if you follow this format, I don't think you'll get lost. Now, if you're curious, this is what a table might look like. And I've put mean, my sample size, standard deviation, kurtosis, and skewness in here. You wouldn't always have all of these. In fact, sometimes you may not have a table at all. I would imagine for a dissertation, unlike maybe a traditional journal article, we are certainly more liberal with reporting tables and figures. In fact, we may require a few more tables and figures than maybe is necessary for a more conservative, space-constrained journal article. And just out of curiosity, this is what a figure may look like. In this case, I got a simple bar graph with males and females, height in inches, and I put 95% confidence intervals, and a nice label. It's in italics. Got the figure in bold, just like table would be in bold. Title is in italics. And that literally is all there is to it, guys. Again, don't let this process overwhelm you. If you follow the simple structure, if you Keep in mind that I'm available during the class, after the class is over. Be glad to help you with this. I enjoy it. Don't worry if you don't master it one term, because it's nearly impossible. See you guys next time.